Thank you so much, and I didn't bring my violin today. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for the invite, Joe, and I'm humbled to be here and to be able to speak to you this evening. So, for those, as mentioned, who follow me on Twitter, I'm an ardent supporter of the EU and the democratic height, the genetics, but actually, because of the title, I will be focusing one core point on the rise of Euroscepticism and the threat that follows it and the impact that it will have. But the preamble, of course, to connect with my own core personal views will be that of optimism, and as the already wonderful keynote address by Lucinda has given, the forward-looking and progressive nature that the EU will have for the global international environment as a whole. So to begin, that was me. That was my preamble. Where did we start? As a peace project among adversaries? What is our greatest accomplishment? The spread of stability and democracy across the continent. And what is our task for the future? To make Europe a global force for good in the world. These are the words of Mr. Solano, the once High Representative for the Common Foreign and Security Policy of the European Union. His words and the images they invoke upon hearing them illustrate to all who seek to listen to them the unique, powerful, and indeed challenging history of the European project itself. Although penned in 2006, a far cry from today's political environment, Mr. Solano's words have, without question, stood the test of time. Moving almost seamlessly between each seismic and political shock felt throughout not only our own regional bloc, but the international community as a whole. Furthermore, if we delve deeper into the scholarship and the history books and the looks of the European project, one quickly finds that Mr. Solano's words do not stand alone. Far from it. Drawing firmly on the ideals and principles of those who have gone before him, notably and not to be forgotten by the history books, Mr. de Gasperi, who was the Italian Prime Minister from 1945 to 53, and a deeply committed founder of the European integration project and the democratic ideals it sought and continues to seek to promote. His view of integration is succinctly written in the florid prose, and I quote, "The future will not be built through force, nor the desire to conquer, but the patient application of the democratic method, the constructive spirit of agreement, and the respect for freedom." The pervasive nature of these words demonstrate their almost universal acceptance by scholars and practitioners alike, a rare feat when it comes to malleable concepts such as democracy. Indeed, the power of their echo has proved immovable and almost steadfast throughout the diplomatic and the political realm. From national ministries to foreign affairs, to individual institutions at the heart of Brussels, to recently established global European embassies, the commitment to these words, that is, the commitment to the ideals of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, have stood the test of time, despite of, or perhaps in light of, the seismic and global political shockwaves recently and unfortunately continuously being felt throughout the world. In my professional opinion, these words, of which there are 1,000 echoes by so many, remain the beating drum to which Europe continues to march. Now, these words have been challenged, deeply challenged, and to deny this would be anything more than foolish. Indeed, such is the central thesis and investigation of this evening's panel. They have been challenged from forces from within and outside of the Union's borders, These sentiments have been rejected entirely, and the narrative for integration digitally weaponized by growing populist movements throughout the continent. We see this through the multiple crises that the EU is now facing. Aside from Brexit, and I can't believe I'm even saying the words aside from Brexit, because it has been all-consuming for so many, and I'm sure so many people in this room for the last 3 years. But this is exactly part of the problem. The resources, time, agenda-setting power, and the diplomatic effort that Brexit has seeped and drained from the mandate and tasks of the European Union is unfathomable, and in my personal opinion, almost unforgivable. The challenges that the EU face remain steadfast and urgent in equal measure. Refugees crossing the Aegean and the Mediterranean Sea, Putin's shadow over the Baltics, a possible new Eurozone debt crisis, President Trump undermining NATO, amongst a variety of things, growing support for challenges to liberal democracy in Hungary and Poland. The list could go on, and so could I. But I know the clock is ticking, and as is the car park, so I will cease there. But we must not buy into the narrative, and I think this is really important to note. We must not buy into the narrative that before Brexit, the EU was a void of historical challenges of threat. The EU has faced profound challenges before, such as the French National Assembly's rejection of a political union in the 1950s, President de Gaulle's empty chair policy in the 1960s, the oil price hikes and stagflation in the 1970s, the battle over the UK's budget contribution in the 1980s, and the various rejections of treaties by the publics of Denmark, Ireland, ourselves included, France and the Netherlands in the 1990s and 2000s. In the face of these challenges, the European integration project has found a way to muddle through, perhaps never as quickly, elegantly, or efficiently as many would have liked, but as quoted once, the car has kept on the road and the bicycle has continued to move forward, or whatever metaphor you'd like to put in yourself. Yet while I acknowledge all the direct and enduring challenges faced by the European Union, as I mentioned previously, the foundational ideals and values of the European founders and those who continue to stand with them and for them, including myself, they have been deeply challenged by some. Most notably, the weaponization of the narrative for integration by growing populist movements throughout the continent. This I like to call, and many would also call, the crisis of rising Euroscepticism. One core threat facing the EU's value and future development. Now, the crisis of rising Euroscepticism is not a new phenomenon. And again, this links to my point regarding Brexit. This is not an isolated event. We have experienced problems before. We are being bought and sold this narrative by the UK that this is one problem that the EU has never faced. We have overcome them before. This is not unique. But the Euroscepticism has loomed large in the life of the EU in recent years and should, as I said, not be isolated or viewed as an issue directly correlated to Brexit alone. Indeed, there has been a significant decline in popular support, and I'm glad I'm backed up by all the positive developments that Lucinda has mentioned. But there has been a significant decline in popular support for European integration, which has been accompanied by increased support for anti-European and deeply Eurosceptic parties. Hungary, Austria, France, Greece, the Netherlands, Poland, and the list continues. It is worth noting that a vast majority, and I think this is a very, very important point to note, that the vast majority of these populist movements, and I say movements now, but they are now turned political and elected officials, are being led by true Machiavellian leaders. Leaders like Machiavelli's described prince, who felt comfortable to reap the monetary and personal rewards of the European Union, be elected to its parliament, while simultaneously seeking to discredit and destroy a project built in the name of peace. Now, this challenge of rising Euroscepticism, or perhaps better conceptualised now as a viable threat, is one that Europe must not only recognise, but must confront directly. This confrontation, no matter how uncomfortable it will be, no matter how long and arduous the task will last, is undeniably imperative to the enduring project of the European Union. And I cannot stress this enough. If Europe truly wishes to recognise and analyse the growing sentiments of not only its individual citizens and social movements, but now, as we are seeing elected politicians sitting in power, it must not deflect, it must not avert, and it must not look away from the assiduous fractioning of political parties across member states, and the widening polarisation of those who reject and those who stand firmly with the values and future development of the Union. Arguably, the failure and the dismissal of many, of which I include myself in this, I failed to recognise this, and I myself dismiss this. As I said, arguably the failure and dismissal of many, as I said, which I include, to truly recognise the power and the impact of this threat will arguably be etched in the history books or tweets as a cardinal failure on all who thought, or indeed were simply hopeful, like myself and so many, that the European Union would never splinter. But my eyes are open now. Our eyes are open now. And we must continue to keep watch, no matter how challenging. Now, the result of the UK's referendum on EU membership, which is directly related to the rise, power and impact of this deep Euroscepticism on the EU, whether founded or unfounded, came as not only a shock to the UK elite, but also to the rest of the EU and to myself. The outcome hit the EU, its member states and its institutions hard for a variety of distinct but interlocking reasons, but perhaps for three in particular. First, it was the first time, barring the exceptional cases of Greenland and Algeria, that the EU would diminish in size. Second, EU actors recognised that the political implications of the UK's decision would reverberate across their domestic political arenas. And third, I think we all know the outcome was simply extremely puzzling. Few could figure out exactly why UK voters wished to leave at this time. We're dissecting it more, of course. Why the UK government would accept the decision when there was such a slim majority in favour of leaving. I'm not going to go into the conceptualisation of democracy at this point in time. 3 days later, we're all stuck in the room. No one gets home in the car park. While the popular support was against what most experts and leading politicians and policymakers advocated for and what the EU would put in its place. But here we are. This is our reality. Tomorrow, the United Kingdom elects a new Prime Minister. And I don't think it's hyperbole now to say that once this handover takes place, the games of the UK will once again change. A game which I add has proved to have no rules, strategies, or even central players, leaving most users rightly confused on how to deal with this game of no rules. But to stress again, this is our reality, and our eyes must be open. Regional blocs, be it the EU, ASEAN, CARICOM, or Mercer, the new global balance of power will arguably be, in my opinion, a tapestry created and weaved by regional blocs connected throughout the world. And having worked for Ireland's mission to the United Nations in New York, I have seen how these resolutions take place, how they are negotiated by regional blocs. So when I teach my students, and the question is asked, is the US global hegemony declining? And if so, what is the new global balance of power? And I receive nearly 90% of the answers saying China. I, of course, if it's argued well, give them a good mark. I'm an objective lecturer, after all. However, I would argue regional blocs is perhaps the new global balance of power. Regional blocs serve as the heartbeat of international relations, and this is mirrored, as mentioned, in the instruments of international negotiations. Today we are living through challenging times, amid shifting geopolitical dynamics, increasing inequality and serious environmental instabilities, which, as Lucinda mentioned, the EU are leading on. With that said, perhaps more than ever, we are relying now on our elected officials and diplomats to chart a course to a safer and fairer world for present and future generations. Should current political instability in its extreme form witnessed during these moments which persist, the resulting policy development of the European Union will not adequately meet its mandate, or worse, become increasingly polarised. Allowing this current landscape to persist and increase with the vigour seen by some member states would be immoral and ill-conceived. Immoral because all people have the right to be governed under a regional bloc that promotes democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Ill-conceived because we already understand that policies and decisions that do not respond or fail to open their eyes to the reality on the ground have little chance of success. Brexit has prompted a fundamental rethink of the EU's global role, given that the UK's intelligence, military, diplomatic, soft power capabilities will no longer be a part of the Union, even if they were never fully in the service of the European goals. And finally, crucially, and I will end with this, it is the very idea of Europe, the pace and the parameters of European integration, the place of the nation-state betwixt and between globalising and domestic pressures, and the business of doing politics in 21st century Europe, which will come under intense scrutiny in the years ahead. But despite the pessimism in which I have perhaps centred on, which is unlike me, regarding the usual narrative I espouse, I have no doubt that the EU, having worked for them, lecturing on it and being deeply involved in this issue, will come out of this stronger, closer, and be a global force for good in this world. With that said, I thank you once again for your time and listening, and I'm humbled to be here.